archivist and local historian at the University of Louisville. Today we're going to walk in Old Louisville's St. James Court and surrounding area. Now, Old Louisville is old, but frankly, not real old. This neighborhood dates from the 1870s and expanded southbound from downtown Louisville, by 1905, 1910. So there are many older neighborhoods closer to the Ohio River. And we are going to be walking in this neighborhood that grew along streetcar lines. For you see, the mule-drawn streetcar was able to allow the separation of work from residence. And that streetcar line moved inexorably out 4th Street. So this is Old Louisville, and Old Louisville dates, as I say, from 1870 to about 1905. So come on, let's head out and see what we can see. Now I need you to kind of use your imagination. Behind me there are Central Park buildings. Before there were Central Park buildings, there was an old house that I'm going to tell you about. But in your imagination, I want you to go back even earlier than that. When this gentle rolling hill, let's call it a little hill, spaced between two southbound turnpikes. The turnpike on the east, which is now 3rd Street, was called the Central Plank Road. It led to the National Turnpike in southern Jefferson County that frankly didn't go very far. The other turnpike over on the west is the Oakland Turnpike. That's modern 7th Street. And tucked between these two turnpikes in the 1830s, when this was still 1.5 miles from the center of the city, this was wilderness. And behind me, sort of to the rear of the buildings that you see back there, Cuthbert Bullitt, in 1837, built a hunting lodge. Out to the south, sweeping to the south, there were forest and standing water swampland. Now keep that log hunting lodge in mind, because we're going to have to go back to it and see it again in our imaginations. Let's head now across Central Park and learn about the building of that old house by Reverend Stuart Robinson. Now that Reverend Stuart Robinson, he was a Presbyterian who came to America to be a minister from Ireland. Reverend Robinson was quite a character. We know he came to Louisville in the late 1850s to pastor the prestigious 2nd Presbyterian Church. Reverend Robinson came out here in what would have then been the country, but we believe he took an old farmhouse back here, and we believe that he expanded it mightily on that hill between the two turnpikes. Now, he added and included the old log hunting lodge as one of the outbuildings associated with the farmhouse. Now, Reverend Stuart Robinson had a problem. Down at 2nd Presbyterian, as the Civil War broke out, he could not help himself. He had to talk about politics from the pulpit. And he was sympathetic to the Confederacy. Well, this was a Union state and a Union city. And while some folks found Reverend Robinson's ideas pretty popular, many folks didn't, especially the federal authorities. They arrested him once. He was in Cincinnati a little later in 1862, and the Reverend Robinson felt the hot breath of the federal government breathing on his neck, and so he took a self-imposed exile from this area. He took a train northbound to Canada, where he remained from 1862 to 1866. By 1868, he was prepared to return to this home over there on the hill, and he expanded it in brick. into an elegant suburban manor house on a gigantic piece of property that originally stretched all the way to the Central Plank Road, which is 3rd Street. And there was a long lane leading up to the house. And right here, there was a giant fountain in front of Reverend Robinson's house. Reverend Robinson only lived in this house in its expanded form for 3 years because there was a knock at the front door. And a year later, Reverend Robinson was out of the house, on the hill, and had gone across the street and built a gigantic Italianate mansion, the one that's now behind the brick wall, just over on the other side of 4th Street there. That is the Robinson Landward House. And that gigantic home was the new home of Reverend Stuart Robinson. Now we're going to move a little closer in order to find out who was knocking at the door at the house on the hill. Who's knocking at the door in the house that once stood behind me on the hill in present-day Central Park? 2 brothers. Those brothers are part of the DuPont family of Wilmington, Delaware. That's the DuPont Corporation, based up in Delaware to this day. The first one came in 1854. His name was Alfred Victor DuPont. We can't say that name over and over again because we're going to talk about the DuPonts a fair amount. Let's call him, Alfred Victor, Uncle Fred. Uncle Fred and the cousin bought a paper mill down at the river at 10th Street and started producing newsprint. A little later, his younger brother came. His name is Biederman DuPont. Let's call him Bid. The cousin went back to Wilmington, and the 2 brothers, now in their 20s still, were here in Louisville for a long time and left a mighty important print on the history of this city. Fred and Bid DuPont. They quickly got diversified. From the paper mill, they had actually drilled an artesian well looking for a better source of water, had too much mineral content. They started bottling that water and marketing that water for its health-giving elixir qualities. In addition to that, they expanded their capitalist enterprises into mule-drawn street railways. They then went into the coal and iron business in Muhlenberg County and other places in Kentucky and beyond. Ultimately, they're going to buy a newspaper or 2. Bid and Uncle Fred DuPont were mighty important people. They're the fellas knocking on the door in 1871 at Stuart Robinson's house, offering a price that he couldn't refuse. No wonder he moved across the street and built an even bigger house. Well, I need to tell you something about Bid and Uncle Fred. Uncle Fred he's actually the person who bought the house. But he was single, never married, and always a little bit disheveled. In fact, he lived his entire life in Louisville in one of the Galt House hotels. But he bought the house and let Bid and his growing family move in. Ultimately, there were going to be Biederman DuPont and these 7 kids living in the big house on the hill, surrounded by the outbuildings, including the old hunting lodge as one of the outbuildings. See the front yard of the home? You know what they did? Generous as they were, Biederman DuPont, by the late 1870s, let his front yard be used as sort of a public park. It was not total public interest to allow folks to use his front yard. He would have band concerts, pyrotechnic displays, fireworks displays put on in his front yard in order to promote the use of his central passenger mule-drawn streetcar line. In fact, this front yard became known as DuPont's Central Park. Now, why Central? Well, maybe because of the central passenger railway that had been extended out forth. Oh, I guess it's possible because of the Central Plank Road over on 3rd Street. But nevertheless, keep that word in mind, Central Park. It goes back to the DuPont's days. So the DuPonts lived in the big house, and Biederman was the person who was generous enough to let folks use the front yard. Now the problem is very, very simple. We are worried about Atlanta, Georgia. After the Civil War and the destruction that occurred there, we're worried about competition economically from Atlanta. Rising phoenix-like from the ashes, someone had proposed a major Southern cotton exposition. Louisville muddled in 1880, while Atlanta took the lead and had a grand exposition. But Louisville's interest in controlling the Southern market would not yield. And by 1883, we are going to have a major grandstand Southern exposition. You're going to be interested in knowing who the chairman of that exposition committee is. The chairman of that exposition committee is none other than Biederman DuPont. He had a site in mind for the Grand Southern Exposition. He said, "See that old wooded swampy land south of my house? Well, a corner of that swamping land had been drained, and in the 1870s, the Louisville Eclipse baseball team played on a baseball diamond over there. But that land was not developed, and Bid said, as chairman of the exposition committee, let's hold the Southern Exposition on that vast tract of land out there." And so the exposition opened. But remember, DuPont's Central Park. The chairman of the committee, Bid, said, "I don't mind you using my front yard for expanding the exposition all the way off the land from the south, all the way across my front yard." And so, when the exposition opened in 1883, guess what? Over where the tennis courts are now in Central Park, that was the lake where you had paddle boats that you could be on during the exposition. And there was an art gallery over in that corner close to 4th and Park. There was also a bandstand where you could have outdoor band concerts. There was a roller coaster in Bid's front yard too. And perhaps more importantly, they ran the prototype electrified street railway, streetcars, off of the exposition site all the way along 4th Street over into Bid's front yard. When the exposition opened, with its major building being south of Bid's front yard, in the undeveloped land to the south, they had built a gigantic exposition hall that was 1 football field long, 200 feet wide. That gigantic exposition hall and the industrial buildings that helped support it went all the way down to Galbraith Street from here at Magnolia Street. And so that was the Grand Southern Exposition. When it opened, guess who came to town? A couple of people that you know. President of the United States, Chester Arthur, was here, and a former Louisvillian who lived in Louisville briefly on Washington Street in the Butchertown neighborhood in the 1860s. Thomas Edison was in town. He was here to assist the president in flipping the switch on the 4,600 incandescent light bulbs that lighted the exposition hall and surrounding grounds. When President Arthur flipped the switch, all of them didn't come on. And Tom Edison went down into the engine room where the generators were to try to crank up some things to get all the lights on. This hall was the first grandly electrified exposition hall in a series of 19th and early 20th century grand expositions. The theme of the Southern Exposition that opened in 1883, Seed to Loom. And one of its major purposes was to promote the industry and commerce of Louisville in order to try to help us hold on to the Southern market. You're not going to believe this. That first year, 1883, 750,000 paid customers walked through the turnstile here at the Southern Exposition. It was a wonderful and delightful time. And Bid DuPont had been the chair of the committee that brought it to the site on the south and the front yard of what was once DuPont's Central Park. Well, the first thing I need to tell you is the tragic end for Uncle Fred, who lived down at the Galt House Hotel. Uncle Fred was a clever and imaginative capitalist, but he had problems with women. But before I tell you about the problem with women, let me tell you something else about him. When they were wiring for the electric street railway at the Southern Exposition, Uncle Fred was frustrated that there weren't enough young, in this case, white men in racially segregated Louisville, who had the kind of skills to help wire, to do the electrical engineering work on that prototype street railway. And he did something about it. A wealthy man he was, though he was pretty disheveled in his dress and manner. Uncle Fred went to the City of Louisville Board of Education, and he said, we got to do something about the skill level of Louisville young people. And so he sponsored a significant donation to build a high school at the corner of Brook and Oak Street that was opened in 1893. That high school was the DuPont Manual Training High School, a high school that's now a math science magnet that still exists in Louisville, though in a different location. But that was part of Uncle Fred's generosity. Just 16 days after the dedication of DuPont Manual Training High School, Uncle Fred was there. Uncle Fred died. Now, the newspaper reports initially said that he died on the front porch of the Galt House Hotel of a heart attack. But many in Louisville knew a lot better, and the truth ultimately came out. Uncle Fred's girlfriend, who sold sex, got in a big argument with Uncle Fred and shot him dead. Maggie Payne was never prosecuted. A nephew scurried Uncle Fred's body off to Wilmington, Delaware for burial. 1893. What happened to Bid? Well, Bid stayed around town, a citizen, an important citizen of Louisville. But in 1904, he decided to move back to Wilmington, his childhood home, and joined the other DuPonts there. He sold the 17.2-acre homestead to the City of Louisville Parks Department. The City of Louisville Parks Department tore down the house and the outbuildings, every one except the old Cuthbert Bullitt hunting lodge of 1837. The Parks Department got a gift from the president of the Louisville Railway Company, who had been associated with the DuPonts in the Street Railway Company, to construct these buildings that you see behind me. Why, that building there, where the 5th District Police Station, that was a public athletic club with a swimming pool and weight rooms. And the building you see where the information center is, that was an open pavilion for get-out-of-the-rain picnics. And the lovely pergola where we began, with its domed area where we began our tour, that was part of that original creation as well. And the Parks Department hired Frederick Law Olmsted Associates out of Brookline, Massachusetts, who had done Central Park in New York City, to design these lovely landscaped walkways out in the old DuPont Park front yard. So that was what happened to Bid. He sold the house, it was torn down, and he went back to Delaware. Now there's one other DuPont who was Bid's son, who was raised in this house that I think you ought to know about. His nickname was Collie, Thomas Coleman DuPont, one of Bitterman DuPont's sons. Collie had moved a couple of years earlier, before 1902, up to Wilmington. He got involved in some investment opportunities. He ran a factory for a while, but in 1902 he got together with two of his cousins up there in Wilmington. They went to the scattered ancestors of the original DuPont black powder operation and did a leveraged buyout. And Collie was made president of the company. And he put the DuPont Corporation on its modern footing as a diversified chemical industry with worldwide influence and relationship. But in 1928, guess what Collie did for Kentucky? At Cumberland Falls, over in the southeastern part of the state, that beautiful, beautiful falls, they were going to build a dam and put in a power plant. Well, Collie stepped forth from Delaware, and he bought 230 acres around the falls, saved the falls from being turned into a power plant and a dam, and dedicated it as a state park to the citizens of Kentucky. Do you know what the name of the lodge is at Cumberland Falls State Park? DuPont Lodge, named for Collie, who gave the gift to the people of Kentucky. Well, we've described the DuPonts and what happened to that clan of humans here in Louisville, or at least most of them. Now we got to determine what happens to an old Southern Exposition site when by 1887 the exposition's done and, they try a floral exhibition and a few other things in the next year, but the truth of the matter is you got a giant exposition hall and it's nobody to use it. So what are you going to do? Well, you're going to tear down the giant exposition hall which stood right behind me. By the way, it had a slate roof. And I know for a fact there were at least 3,000 wooden chairs in that exposition hall. Keep those in mind. You tear the exposition hall down and sell the land to some subdividers. In the 19th century, they called it an addition. And in fact, when they announced the new lots for sale in this new addition, they didn't do it with a whole lot of imagination. In 1888, the advertisements went out and they called it the Central Park Addition. This behind you was Magnolia Street. This street here was, 5th Street. And so the lots did not sell. A year later, William H. Slaughter, who was in on the original investment group, he reorganized the subdivision sales with a new idea. Let's promote this new court, this new residential area on the site of the old exposition. Let's promote it as an elegant reflection of the fashionable Victorian suburbs that are in the surrounds of London. But we got to do it with a little flair. Let's turn this mall into a landscape garden. I know what we need, William H. Slaughter said. We need some symbols of the British monarchy. And there sits the lion, and there were others around as well. We need an elegant Victorian fountain in the center of the mall. And above all, we got to change the names of these streets. 5th Street, let's name it for the Court of St. James, the name for the British monarchy. And Magnolia in this part, let's name it Victoria Place for Queen Victoria. Well, in 1889, Slaughter's new Victoria Land Company put up their lots for sale, and they started selling like hotcakes. And so you have the evolution on the site of the old exposition site, this elegant Victorian subdivision. If there's a way of describing St. James Court, is that it has the lovely, well-tended public space that dramatically sweeps into the Central Park. And that public space is what makes this neighborhood tick. Let's see one of the early houses. Took 2 years to build. Let's go see the Conrad Caldwell house. The corner lot here at St. James Court was sold to Theophilus Conrad. What a name. He made leather goods. He had come from Alsace. And he came out here in 1893, bought the lot, and took 2 years to build what's called the castle. Theophilus Conrad's castle. It plays Victorian dress-up in the most dramatic way. Can you see the symbol of the city? The Bourbon family's fleur-de-lis? Can you see all of the mean-faced creatures on the front of the building? And look at the shell motif up at the top, in the triangle at the top. It even has a mean face there as well. But there are plenty of mean faces, plenty of decoration, and plenty of fleur-de-lis decorating Theophilus Conrad's castle. About 10 years or so after Theophilus Conrad had built his house, he died, and it was sold to the Caldwell family. Now the house belongs to the St. James Court Association and is open for the public for receptions and is used as a historic home. By the way, this court and the adjacent residential courts served as sort of a magnet, yes, for some of Louisville's most wealthy and powerful citizens. But it also attracted an interesting mix of artists, writers, and others. And that's part, I think, of what makes the story of this St. James Court and surrounding area so interesting for us. Now, I need to tell you, I don't know whose idea it was, but I do know that Meta Coleman decided to put a swimming pool in her backyard for the kids. It was not an under-the-ground swimming pool. It was a gigantic tank that stood in the backyard where neighborhood kids and friends of the family and family members could all take a plunge. But they decided that they needed a dressing room for guests to change into their swimming suits. Come on down, and I'm going to show it to you. Next door, in an open lot at the rear, Meta Coleman decided to get a hold of the old log hunting lodge that stood next to the house on the hill. Put that baby on rollers, rolled it down the alley, and put it right there at the rear of the lot. First it was logs, now it's covered by clapboards, and in the center where the red door is where the old log hunting lodge sits to this day. Oh, they used it for more than just changing bathing suits. They used it for indoor dancing classes. Some of the servants at times lived there. They also used it as a gymnasium, a place to play out of the rain. All of those uses. But by 1942, the last of the recognizable DuPonts moved into the old hunting lodge. By 1950, she had expanded to the south and expanded the house to the north. And that DuPont was the colorful Ethel DuPont. She came to Louisville as a liberal's liberal. The capitalist of Wilmington, Delaware surely must have been uncomfortable with Ethel DuPont, though she frequently went back to visit. For instance, she was a member of the Socialist Party in the 1920s. She was a strong advocate for racial justice in this community. She was a feminist before feminism was cool. She wrote a column in the Louisville Times in the 1930s and 1940s on Louisville's labor movement and put it in the most positive light. She was a stockholder in the General Motors Corporation, went to the stockholders meeting and demanded from the floor that General Motors open their corporate books to the UAW, the labor union that was representing General Motors employees. Ethel DuPont lived in this house until 1980. In 1957, she was one of the major promoters of the art fair that has now expanded to adjacent streets and draws 300,000 people to that 3-day fair that's in the first Saturday in every October, the St. James Art Fair. Ethel DuPont was one of the true characters here on St. James Court. This was the Owen Tyler House. This is a dramatic piece of architecture. You talking about imagination. Look at the highly decorative footprints that are on either side of the steps at the base of the columns. Look at the scrolling around the third floor windows. But even more importantly, this house suggests that moment in world history when Christianity meets Islam. That highly decorative, almost Moorish style architecture is so dramatic here in the Owen Tyler House. There is also a wonderful, wonderful bay window here on the driveway with leaded glass. And do you see that carriage house in the rear? Guess what artist perfected her craft in that carriage house? Mary Alice Hadley founded her Hadley pottery operation out of the carriage house in the 1940s here behind the old Owen Tyler House. You know why they were here in part? George, he worked at the end of St. James Court at Hill Street. He worked for the Louisville Board of Education. We'll be there in just a little bit. Here in the center of the Landscape Mall on St. James Court is that very, very graceful center. The fountain is delightful. It features cupids spraying water on a lovely lady at the center. And then toward the base of the fountain, there are kids. But two of the kids have swans flapping around on their shoulders. This fountain has been a little challenging for this neighborhood. By the way, this neighborhood, in order to maintain this landscaped area, had one of the nation's earliest continually active neighborhood associations. Somebody's got to put a whole lot of shoulder into maintaining this lovely public space. And so, therefore, very early, we found that kids were climbing into the fountain to go swimming. At one point in the 1940s, the neighborhood association put bushes stringed with barbed wire in it in order to keep kids out of the center. Somebody else had a good idea that didn't work. They said, let's put some goldfish into the fountain. Well, everybody started feeding the goldfish and the water turned putrid, and that turned out not to be a good idea. It was originally a cast iron fountain, but by the 1970s was badly deteriorated. They took it down for 3 years and had it recast in bronze. They had also earlier gotten the balcony railing from the Strand movie theater that was torn down downtown and put it around the fountain. So there's been a whole lot of effort and will that has gone into maintaining the St. James Court fountain. Hey, do you remember Theophilus Conrad up on the corner? That guy didn't know when to quit. In 1897, he made every one of his new neighbors so mad they went to court. You know what he did? See that building right there? That is the St. James Flat. That's a 19th century word for an apartment. It was built by Theophilus Conrad. He built it 6 stories tall, bigger and grander than any of the houses that were around it. The neighbors went to court arguing that this apartment building was a business. The conservative courts at the time ruled, oh, no, it's not a business, it's a residence. And so they allowed Theophilus Conrad's folly to stand 6 stories tall. But in 1912, there was a tragic fire. The top 3 stories burned away. Maybe the neighbors felt better because then St. James Flat fit into the adjoining neighborhood a whole lot better. There was a poet who lived in this house. In fact, he was Kentucky's first poet laureate, Madison Cawein. His poetry exalted nature and the kinds of feelings and emotions that come from reflection about and within nature. This is the Madison Kawine House. You know, one of the things I love about Victorian dress-up, you can even put a finial or a top knot on top of a tower. Here, Louisville's fleur-de-lis is on top of the tower. In addition to that, look in bas-relief at that gigantic torch with flames lapping out the top. Just one more way of playing Victorian dress-up here in this neighborhood. I got to tell you, there was a young woman who had volunteered in a Christian church mission in a very poor, I believe, mostly white neighborhood that was about 5 blocks behind us here. On the backside, I believe, of the old Oakland thoroughbred racetrack, which had been so popular in Louisville in the 1830s into the 1850s. That racetrack was used by the Union Army for horses during the Civil War. But after the track was abandoned, poor people moved into the backside. The poor people had gardens in order to try to feed themselves, and they ate a lot of cabbage. And so that neighborhood became popularly known as the Cabbage Patch neighborhood. Well, Alice Hagen volunteered over in the Cabbage Patch neighborhood, and she met a woman by the name of Mary Bass who lived over on West Hill Street in the Cabbage Patch neighborhood. And Alice Hagen wrote a novel based on the life and dramatic experiences of this indomitable human spirit. She called the character in her novel Mrs. Wiggs of the Cabbage Patch. In 1901, published it as a novel. It was on the bestseller list for 2 years. It was adapted for the stage and was a popular dramatic presentation all over the country and in Europe. It was translated into many languages. There were 100 printings of that novel by Alice Hagen. Alice Hagen made enough money that by 1910, she had gotten married soon after she published the novel to Cale Rice, who was a poet and writer in his own right. And Cale and Alice moved into this house in 1910. This is the Alice Hagen House and is a reminder of the many artists who lived here on St. James Court. Now, this house reminds us that there were political leaders on St. James Court as well. This is Charles Granger's house. He was the mayor of the city of Louisville in the early 1900s. Granger owned a foundry and was an iron merchant and was also president of the Louisville Jockey Club. He teamed up with Matt Wynn to make the Kentucky Derby an international racing sports event. Very early, this grand house was built here at the intersection of St. James Court and Belgravia Court. You know where Belgravia is? It's one of the very fashionable near downtown London, England suburbs, and was platted in the 1820s, and in the late 19th century would have been considered as upscale. And so, therefore, yet another name used by William H. Slaughter to attract folks to his Victoria Land Company subdivision. But this house, it was built with in its grand scale right here at the corner. It has a wonderful bas-relief design on the west side. Pretty early, the house was painted pink. Now, maybe not bubble gum pink with purple trim, but nevertheless, it became known very early as the Pink Palace. It once housed the WCTU state headquarters, the Women's Christian Temperance Union state headquarters. It also is called the casino. I read in just one source that it was called the casino because at one time the house served as kind of a neighborhood social center. But look at the words painted on the front door now, the Pink Palace, a name that it has gone by for some time. By the way, it has a swimming pool in the side yard. The parfait over here on your right, Now, I don't know, I did find in a city directory of about 1903 a guy that lived around on Hill Street, very near here, by the name of Frank Parfit. He worked right here in the neighborhood. Maybe he built the apartment, but it's called the Parfit. Over here on your left is the Plaza. The Plaza plays upscale East Coast city. You ought to see those wonderful private balconies. And the condominiums that are in the building now, they are delightful. But this great building also features iron canopies over the doors that suggest almost a porte-cochere like you would find in Manhattan. This is the Plaza, one of the two residential anchors to St. James Court. Oh, I forgot to tell you, look what holds up the iron porch of the Plaza. Decorative chain coming out of the mouth of lions. Well, here at St. James Court and Hill, on the corner behind me, in 1899 with some fanfare, the Louisville Girls High School opened. Now, they were there until 1934 in that imposing red brick structure. Then they moved to Halleck Hall about 4 blocks to the southeast. By 1950, they had become part of Manual High School. But when the girls moved out, the Louisville Board of Education moved in, and they were there until 1971, when the building was torn down. We've rounded the corner onto Hill Street. We're headed east toward 4th. You see that big lot behind me? In fact, it reached all the way across St. James Court and headed west on Hill. There was an auditorium theater there, and ultimately an outdoor amphitheater. It was developed just after the Southern Exposition ended. Do you remember the 3,000 chairs at the Southern Exposition? Well, William F. Norton Jr. bought them, and he put them in the theater on the other side of the street. He called his Temple of Muses greater than any on this entire continent. He had Gilbert and Sullivan operettas around a lake in the outdoor amphitheater. At one point, he had a velodrome, a bicycle racing track with a boxing ring in the middle. But William F. Norton Jr. never used that name. He was an impresario, and he used the name Daniel Quilp. Daniel Quilp was the meanest man that Charles Dickens ever created, meaner than Ebenezer Scrooge by far. Quilp is that lecher who chased poor Nell across the pages of the old curiosity shop. The amphitheater auditorium closed in 1904, shortly after William F. Norton's death. You know what he said about his dear hometown of Louisville, this character who wore a fireman's outfit to a Baptist baptism, afraid that he would get too wet by the immersion. You know what he thought about Louisville? He was always poking fun at us. He said that he was the Duke of Deadville. In his will, he said, I want to be buried away from Louisville, where I've already been buried alive for so many years. But you know, he finally loved his hometown. When he died, he left $1 million to the Baptist orphanage. Well, we've come off of Hill Street, headed north on 4th, and now left onto Belgravia Court. It's a true residential court, named for that fashionable London suburb platted in the 1820s. A residential court? That's where the houses press a little closer to a pedestrian walkway. Not a street, not a carriageway, but press close to the walkway. You know what that means? It means that while this is not a gated residential street, it does presume that as the gawkers walk by, they might be welcome to look in the front window from the sidewalk, but most of the living is going to be in the courtyards and on the decks and the patios to the side and to the rear. That's what I believe a residential court achieves. This anchor on the east end of Belgravia Court is one of my favorite houses. I love the decorations, the symbol of the city of Louisville, the fleur-de-lis on top, all of the embellishment, and the curved stairway that leads to the second level and the basement entrance. You know, You might find this house in Charleston, South Carolina, but I'll bet you'll see something a whole lot more like this in Boston's Back Bay or the Upper West Side of Manhattan. This has that brownstone look of the Eastern Seaboard. Now, East Coast cities have the row house as well. I suspect Louisville had a whole lot more row houses like this one near downtown, but we forgot and happily didn't bulldoze these. This is a delightful row house. Do you like it for energy conservation? A shared common wall between the very distinct houses, all connected with one another in a row. One of the beauties of this neighborhood is that you can have a single-family house next to a multifamily house. And one of the ways you do it is with that connected row house that goes around a corner. Here at Belgravia Court and St. James, there are 3 examples of multifamily houses. The one over there behind you, it's the one that reaches around the corner. There are probably 6 or 7 living units. And the same's true with this series of buildings connected to one another around the corner. You know, on our planning commission here in Louisville, we've been arguing about, in new subdivisions, can you put some houses that are more moderately priced in a subdivision of very expensive homes? The answer is, of course you can, with the kind of traditional design that you see on 3 corners here at this intersection. Now, it will not surprise you as we have walked north on 6th Street that the houses on the right side of the street could not have been built before 1889, because that whole sector to the east was part of the exposition site. In 1929, the Cabbage Patch settlement left the original Cabbage Patch neighborhood and moved over here on the east side of 6th Street, right behind St. James Court. A Presbyterian young woman concerned about the poverty and the difficulties of life and spirit in the Cabbage Patch neighborhood. Louise Marshall was her name. She founded the settlement. Guess who one of the original board of directors was? Alice Hagen from over on St. James Court. There was a Louisville bookseller by the name of Elijah Levering who built that giant house over on the left. By 1890, guess what? The owner of the house at that time decided to cover it with the slates from the roof of the old Southern Exposition. So the Levering House is known as the Slate House. By 1892, the Levering House has become the first of a series of medical facilities. First in 1892, Jenny Cassidy, a delightful human spirit in Louisville who was physically disabled herself, sponsored one of her many, many medical facilities and facilities for women. This was the Jenny Cassidy Infirmary for Women, and that meant a hospital or a place where poor women could come. Later, it was Dr. Board's Sanitarium. At one time, the Levering House housed Dr. Lewis McMurtry's OB/GYN clinic, and another time it was the Louisville Neuropathic Hospital, a mental facility. See the building that's kind of tucked back on the right side? That was built in about 1908, 1909 as the physician's residence for the medical facility with a breezeway connecting the 2 buildings. Now remember the name Levering. It's going to come back to us. Well, we've walked north along 6th Street toward Central Park. Now we're at Magnolia Street. Remember, that was old Victoria Place. We're going to turn left here at 6th and now Magnolia and head into the 600 block of Magnolia. There's a story over there that I'm especially excited to tell you. Come on over. Well, we're moving toward the middle of the block on the 600 block of Magnolia, no more than a block and, maybe a block and a half from St. James Court. And this is a restaurant run by Eddie Garber. The number 610 suggests the very busy commercial district that once existed in this block. This commercial district was a meeting place between the financially comfortable white folks who lived along St. James Court and immediately surrounding residential courts, and a large African American population that lived in this immediate area. Look, here's the old Newfer Grocery, one of three that used to be in this block. That rusticated block building is just a reminder of all the busyness that used to be in this sector. Why, the Norman Apartments were here on your left. The old brick building here up on the left was the Magnolia Inn, one of three restaurants in this area. The police district headquarters was in the middle of the block. The ice house was on the corner. There were beauty shops and barber shops and an automobile repair shop and a confectionery or a candy store, as well as several other businesses here in this area. Now, where did the African Americans live? They lived just around the corner behind me on Levering Street. Does that suggest the possibility that Elijah Levering's home, built, we think, right at the end of Civil War, might have had African American servants, perhaps even former slaves, who lived here in this area? But all we know is that the neighborhood is called Black Hill. And I'll tell you what I found out. What I found out, and much to my surprise, that along Levering Street and on both sides of 6th Street Alley behind the Levering house, there were over 100 bungalows, sometimes duplex, sometimes single-family houses, over 100 houses where African Americans lived in this, the Black Hill neighborhood. It was a very dense and vital neighborhood where folks worked at Vogt Manufacturing, worked at the old R.B. Tyler construction and highway building material place, here now where Cook Air Filter has bought up many of the lots in the old neighborhood. And the center of the Black Hill neighborhood was the New Hope Baptist Church. That church was founded in 1872 in a Bible study group out by the Oakland racetrack. They moved here in the early 1870s to the Black Hill neighborhood. First, the church was just in one of the bungalows, and for really several years. Finally, though, Reverend William Washington came to the congregation. He had been born in slavery in the South, had a day job while he was still pastoring the church here. Reverend Washington, at the end of World War I, led the New Hope congregation in building first a one-story in rusticated block, rough-hewn block, and then a second story with a curved stairway that went into the second level where the sanctuary was. They finished the job by 1924. In 1969, the New Hope congregation left this building and moved to Dixie Highway, where the congregation still exists. But New Hope provided both nourishment for spirit and body to the residents of the Black Hill neighborhood, where once there were over 100 homes with many, many more citizens living in them, and now today there are only 4 houses remaining in an area that is impinged upon by an expanding industry. Now, you and I both know that I can't look a lot of what I just told you up in a book. The woman that lives in that bungalow there has been living here in the Black Hill neighborhood since 1925. And Virginia Berry has been a key informant with memories of this wonderful and resilient and struggling Black Hill neighborhood, so close to St. James Court. You're going to ask me why this neighborhood is called Black Hill. I really don't know. and Virginia wasn't able to tell me for sure either. But I speculate that clearly because of early African American residents on a very gentle ascending hill, there is something of a hill here, might accommodate or might explain the name. Well, we're just about to come full circle on this walking tour of Old Louisville, St. James Court, and surrounding areas. You remember the preacher who couldn't keep politics out of the pulpit, who bought and expanded the house on the hill and moved to the big Italianate house across the street. Stuart Robinson? He died in 1881, but he had been instrumental in trying to sponsor Presbyterian mission in this neighborhood. And so when the church opened on the corner here, and the church is now a residence, incidentally, but when the church opened 10 years after Stuart Robinson's death, they named it the Stuart Robinson Memorial Presbyterian Church. Just about to come full circle. Well, thank you for walking with me. You've been troopers. We have come full circle. We're back to the old exposition site of 1883, just south of DuPont Central Park. You know, what's the magic of this entire neighborhood where we've walked? I think the magic dwells in several elements. One is the manicured public space that opens the folks to this grand vista that reaches out into Central Park. I think also it's the variety of architectural style, the variety of humans in color shade, the variety of housing stock, multifamily and single family, all along the side of one another. I think another part of the magic is that these folks need to know how to put on public events and festivals. You don't live in this neighborhood unless you're prepared to see some gawkers walk down the sidewalk out front. But also, it's the memory of those spirits of the past who have dwelled in this neighborhood, resilient, strong, imaginative, resourceful, and generous. It's those spirits that haunt this place to this day that give this neighborhood its magic. Thanks for walking with me.